we talked about the Cold War, and one of the major um, points that I brought up about the Cold War was that the Cold War happened between 1945 and really about 1992 or three, and at the same time there was another um, phenomenon or process happening in the world. Does anybody remember what that other process was?
Decolonization.
Exactly, decolonization, and that means that all the formerly colonized countries, or almost all the formerly colonized countries, became independent sometime between 1945 and 1965. Okay, and so while the consequence of decolonization was to create a large number of very poor countries who are struggling with the effects of colonialism, and all of that is happening in the context of this ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. And what we're going to do today is we're going to actually show two different examples of that, um, I guess, the confluence of events. And I'm going to start with Cuba, and then I'm going to start talking about Vietnam. Okay. So before I get started, any questions, comments about anything? All right. Well, you guys will recall that we talked about Cuba a bit earlier when we were talking about imperialism. And we talked about how the United States, at the beginning of the war, Spanish-American War, declared that it had no interest in annexing Cuba, that the American involvement in the Spanish-American War was simply to assist the independence movement in Cuba, and that was stated in what becomes known as the Teller Amendment. But then you'll also recall that at the end of the war, the United States um, actually created a constitution for Cuba, and at the same time um, declared in another amendment, the Platt Amendment, that the United States had the right to intervene in Cuba anytime that the Cuban government acted in a way that was irresponsible. So what would be a way that the Cuban government could act irresponsibly and trigger American involvement? What do you guys think? How do you think that? What do you think that means that the United States can decide how the government of Cuba could act in an irresponsible way? Do you guys remember that part of the reason why the United States got involved in Cuba was because of the sugar industry? That the Americans actually owned the sugar fields and the sugar processing plants, and that the unrest in Cuba before the Spanish-American War was creating problems for American businessmen, and so the American businessmen were lobbying to get the Americans involved in Cuba to establish some stability so that they could continue to make money, right? And what ended up happening was that after the war was over, the United States then continues to dominate the Cuban economy. So that's what we would call, before we had mentioned, we'd called it economic imperialism. That the United States is theoretically, that Cuba actually rules itself, is sovereign, but at the same time, the United States controls its economy because American business interests control the sugar fields, and that's the major export of Cuba. It's monostaple economy, right? And so what that means then is that the United States supports men who are theoretically elected to office, but who also support the rights of American business interests. And if those interests are threatened, then the United States can send in troops, okay? And that would be what it meant to be irresponsible. Irresponsible would mean basically the idea of nationalizing the sugar industry. Because what had happened was that because the Americans owned the sugar fields and the sugar industry, there was a movement among some people in Cuba to take those assets away from American business and nationalize them, so that the profits from the sugar industry wouldn't go to American business owners, but to the Cuban people. You guys are following me here? One of these people was named Fidel Castro. And the one thing that we want to know about Fidel Castro is that he was not a communist. Okay, he was a nationalist, an economic nationalist, and what that meant was that he believed that the government of Cuba should act for the benefit of the people of Cuba and not for the benefit of American business interests. But American government actually supports a number of different dictators in Cuba, so long as they play ball with the American business interests. You guys are following me here? Questions, comments? Okay, so there was a kind of a little bit of a rebellion in Cuba in the 1920s, and Castro was arrested and eventually got out of jail and went to Mexico. But then he's going to so we're looking for. He's going to try another invasion, another takeover of the Cuban government in the 1950s. And what ends up happening is that he ends up fighting a guerrilla war from the hills, and eventually that guerrilla war will be successful. What happens is that there is I forgot the name of the dictator, whoever was in Juan Bautista was in control of Cuba, and it became obvious to Americans that Bautista was no longer in control. And so the Americans abandoned support of Bautista. He went into exile, and Castro then came to power, and the American government initially supported Castro because they said, well, you can be, Bautista was our guy, but now you can be our guy. But the problem was that that Fidel didn't want to play along, all right? And he was serious about nationalizing the sugar industry. He had one of his kind of right-hand man, an advisor, was a man named Ernesto Guevara, who you probably know as Che Guevara, right? And he was an Argentine doctor, but he was a committed socialist. Castro was not a communist or a socialist. Castro was actually against the Communist Party. He refused to allow the Communist Party to participate in the government that he established in Cuba. But his idea of nationalizing the sugar industry was really seen by many as a socialist, a movement towards Marxism, kind of, in a way, right? So what happens then is that Castro alienates the American government because he's in favor of nationalizing the sugar industry. And from the American point of view, nationalizing the sugar industry is communism. Okay, and remember what we talked about on Monday. If Americans see communism anywhere, who's behind it? Russia, exactly. In this case, Russia was not behind it, and Castro was not a communist. But if your enemy in the 1960s is the United States, then who's your friend? Russia, exactly. And so what happens is that the United States declares an embargo against Cuba, basically saying, we're not going to buy your sugar anymore, which is devastating to the Cuban economy because that's all the money that they make is by selling sugar to America. And instead, what happens is that the Russian government comes in and says, okay, we're going to support your sugar industry. We're going to give you subsidies for your sugar industry. Um, but you have to say that you're a communist. And you have to have a communist government, right? And so Castro at that point then says, okay, I'm a communist. I've always been a communist and I will always be a communist, even though historically he wasn't a communist, right? So why did he all of a sudden now say that he was a communist?
because
Well,
he
they
had
have.
Russian. So, oh, sorry, because he had Russian support, and
In order to get that Russian support.
yeah,
So instead of the United States supporting economic independence for Cuba, they essentially drove them into the arms of the Soviets. You follow what I'm saying? And I should say this, that the Soviet presence in Cuba wasn't necessarily good for the Cuban people. But nevertheless, the fact that it falls into the Russian orbit was based on the misconception of Americans that communism was associated only with the Soviet Union. You guys are with me? Questions, comments about that? All right. So now what happens is I'm not going to go into the Bay of Pigs, although the Bay of Pigs, you can look it up. It's in the book. The thing about the Bay of Pigs was it demonstrated to the world, essentially, that the United States was willing to use military force to overthrow Castro. And then as a result of that, the Soviets start to install nuclear missiles in Cuba. Okay. The thing about the nuclear missiles in Cuba is that these missiles were in position where you can see this big red circle here, right? They could have devastated all of these American cities, including Washington, D.C. Okay. The reality of the situation, which is often overlooked, is that the Americans, the United States, had missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union were in range of Moscow, right? And so the Soviets had been trying for years to get the Americans to remove those missiles. And they saw this as an opportunity to leverage that that desire by installing missiles in Cuba. The idea being they install the missiles in Cuba, and now if the United States demands that those missiles be removed, then the Soviets will demand that American missiles are removed from Turkey. You guys follow what I'm saying here? This makes sense to you guys? Do you guys know about this?
yeah. I remembered it was like a failed invasion of the Bay of Pigs, and that kind of like set everyone off and like scared.
Right. Okay. So now what happens then is that the United States learns about these missile installations by satellite, essentially by spy satellite, right, or spy airplanes, and instead of going to war over it, President Kennedy actually declares an embargo around Cuba. This is the exclusion zone right here, the kind of the purplish area, right? And basically says that any ship that crosses into this exclusion zone is subject to destruction. And what that's aimed at is the material coming from Russia to Cuba to support these missiles, right? And so there was a standoff. The standoff lasted for about a week, and it basically was that the United States and the Soviet Union were on the brink of a nuclear war. And it was a very real possibility. And this is one of the reasons why when you guys read the book, The Good War, and the last story in there was about the street corner kids and how they were afraid that they weren't going to live long enough to have lives because of the nuclear weapons, right? This is what contributed to that. Americans were terrified of nuclear weapons, and really everybody in the world was at the time, right? Okay, so anyway, eventually what happens is that what Kennan had predicted, you guys will remember the long telegram, from Monday. And what Kennan had predicted was that if you go toe to toe with the Russians all the way up to the brink of war, that they would back down. And that's exactly what happened. So they get right to the brink of war, and Khrushchev decides to pull the missiles out of Cuba. What another thing that's little known is that when Khrushchev removed the missiles from Cuba, the United States also removed its missiles from Turkey, and that was actually a quid pro quo. But it wasn't advertised, right? So it made it look like Russia had backed down, and that's just the way history records it. But the main point here, in terms of talking about Cuba, is that the whole issue was created by the fact that the United States saw the Soviets where they weren't. Because for the Americans, communism was a monolithic world movement based in Moscow. And they could not imagine that any other country would opt for communism without encouragement from the Soviet Union. You guys are with me? And so basically then the whole thing was created by that mischaracterizing communism in Cuba as part of the Cold War.